Thank you all for joining us. Obviously, this is a really important topic. I'm going to say a few very brief words before I introduce the panel. Obviously, this has been already a very big year for privacy, and it's only September. As you hear in all the other sessions and on the floor, we're really racing to get more mobile devices in the ecosystem, and then through sensor technology to get more things to be attached that aren't mobile devices, but that become mobile devices when they connect it up. As we're doing that, of course, this raises increasing concerns about data collection, monetization, and all those issues have moved back into the spotlight. I think they were quiet for a little while. On the legal front, earlier this year, I guess late last year, the European Court invalidated the safe harbor that was used for many years by U.S. companies to more easily comply with the EU's very different privacy laws than U.S. laws. And then, of course, we replaced that with something called the Privacy Shield. It's now gone into effect, but a lot of doubts remain about its legal life and whether or not it's actually going to stay. Of course, meanwhile, here in the U.S., as we'll talk about with the panel, the FCC is moving forward on a plan to regulate ISPs, and at least under the initial description, that would follow a very different, in fact, a completely different paradigm than the one that has been used up till now, largely by the Federal Trade Commission, and one, frankly, that has been the source of a lot of the growth of the internet, so there's a lot of concerns there. And then finally, California court, just in the last weeks, recently ruled that the FCC's decision to reclassify ISPs as common carriers had the inadvertent effect, or maybe the inadvertent effect, of completely cutting the FTC out of the equation as far as regulation of ISPs for everything, including for privacy. So with all that said, it seems like if we're going to avoid a real meltdown in the privacy space, that's going to be largely the responsibility of the industry to continue regulating itself, to be more formal about that, to be more aggressive about that. And so to do that, we're going to discuss that today with my very distinguished panel of participants. I'm going to introduce them very quickly. I have Kirsten McMullen, who's the Chief Privacy Officer at 4Info. I have Mario Proietti, who's the CEO of LocationSmart, and then last but not least, Mary Clark, who's the CMO of Syniverse Technologies. So I'm going to now sit down and sort of talk to these guys and take it up. So let me just start with a sort of introductory question and give you a chance to introduce yourselves. One important concept, and the title of this particular panel is privacy design. So this has been a term that's been thrown around now for several years. And not really everyone, as far as I can tell, has the same view of what that means and how you engage it. So to start us off, I'd like you to, each of you to sort of start by telling, and we'll go just down the line this time, what do you think privacy design means, and then at your organization, how do you use that in terms of your products and services? So we'll start with you, Kirsten.
Hi, I'm Kirsten. I'm with 4Info, which is a mobile advertising technology company. For us, privacy by design meant building privacy into our product from the get-go. So we originated as an SMS company, had a lot of phone numbers, and privacy was very important to us in that respect. But as we evolved into using data from mobile devices for display advertising, particularly location data, privacy was critical for us, but there was no framework, no self-regulatory framework. We were ahead of any outside guidance. So,
when was this?
2011.
Okay.
Yeah, started in 2009 when we really started diving into the privacy aspect. But iPhones were still new then. There weren't as many apps gathering location data back then. So what we did as we built our new product is literally tried to make privacy part of it at every single step. Engineering and product teams had to keep it top of mind, and we kind of used the behavioral advertising guidance for the regular internet, the non-mobile internet, which ultimately is what the self-regulatory guidance ended up being like. So it worked out well for us. But as we go on, it's about training all of our teams to understand privacy issues so they can proactively recognize when a brilliant product idea might also be perceived as a violation of a consumer's privacy or might be unexpected by the consumer. So helping those who are having innovative ideas about mobile ad products also think from the position of the consumer.
Great, thank you. So Mario, what does privacy design by design mean to you?
Yeah, thanks, Larry. Yeah, Mario Proietti from LocationSmart, and our focus is on, just so to provide the context, aggregating location information from multiple sources, including carrier networks, as well as databases that might be crowdsourced, and mobile device applications. So we kind of in this situation where we're under a mix of rules under FTC for some of those sources, and FCC by virtue of obtaining data directly from carriers. So it creates a little bit of a confusing situation for some applications that might use those in combination. And we try to address it in the design of basically the overall way we deliver the services, including what we build into the technology, the processes we follow for giving our customers who are enterprises. We generally focus on business that want information about where their consumers, workers, or assets are, and giving them an understanding in the process of implementing the solution on some of the policies, and that's the third aspect of it, making those policies into digestible capabilities in our product, technology, and in the processes we convey to them. And keeping that kind of a forefront in ultimately what is delivered. And that really puts a lot of burden on us on the front end when the customer comes to us, similar to what Kirsten said, where somebody may have a great idea on what they want to do, but when you look at how the technology has to be delivered to maintain privacy best practices and be in compliance, some of those ideas may have to be shut down, or the process for delivering them might have to be taken into account as well.
Great, thank you. Mary?
I think we're going to hear a lot of the same challenges across the three of us. My name is Mary Clark. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for Syniverse. Syniverse has been around for decades, and we are a global company providing services to mobile network operators, about 1,000 around the world, but we also serve brands and enterprises globally to help them in their mobile marketing actions that they want to take to engage that consumer. So it is taking everything that you may know about your consumer, whether you're in retail or financial services or travel and hospitality, and being able to reach out and engage that consumer over and above any other way that you're doing so in any other channel. And Syniverse is, we're talking to CMOs all the time and people in their creative teams, and they're like, oh, okay, so I'd love to be able to do this, or I'd love to be able to do that. And they're like, okay, well, where's privacy fitting into this? What is the way in which you have managed to ensure that you have permission-based marketing as a part of the entire way in which you're interacting with your consumer? And there are a lot of behavioral issues that come into play. There's nothing like our relationship with our mobile device that we have today. There's nothing that we quite have had any time in our experience in our lives, in our history as human beings, that is so personal as the way we use this device. And so I think what we're struggling with and trying to work through challenges with our customers is to still, while maintaining a true faith to managing and keeping in mind the privacy and the wantedness that the consumer is trying to see. I only want to get stuff that I want to get and be interacted with in a way that I want to be. We're also trying to push the boundaries of innovation and try to help utilize the mobile device as much as you possibly can to change the paradigm in the way in which any one of these verticals is trying to reach the consumer. So it is a real day-to-day challenge that we're fighting here, I think, and based on what you guys have just said, I think it's very similar. So
one of the main issues I think that companies like yours have is that what consumers say and what consumers do are very different things. It's very difficult in some ways to know what they want, what's acceptable, what's not, because their behavior doesn't match their responses. So, Mary, let me start with you, because your company recently released a really quite in-depth survey of consumer behaviors and consumer attitudes. Say a little about that and tell us, what, from your standpoint, what remains to be done to kind of figure out how to best serve consumers without antagonizing them unintentionally.
Making them unhappy, right? We want to avoid that. We want happiness to be what most people are feeling. It was one of those things where you constantly were hearing the anecdotes from customers when we would sit down with the marketing department and we would sit down with the creative team, and they'd be talking about, well, we've tried this, we've tried that. There was this constant repetition of, well, we believe consumers feel X. We believe our customers feel Y. There was a lot of anecdotal sort of perspective. So we said, okay, let's just do some primary research. So we went out into 8 different countries via the mobile device and asked consumers questions about, what do you feel comfortable in sharing about your private data? When do you? If you were being asked questions from a retailer, from a banking provider, from a travel and hospitality provider, from your mobile operator, do you feel comfortable sharing private information with them? If you were to get something in return for sharing that private information, do you feel a little bit differently about it? Do you feel better about it? We asked really sort of in-depth questions to get at what are the driving concerns that consumers have in sharing private data on the mobile device. And it came back to sort of 3 primary areas. The first one was just security. What are you going to do with it? Can you take care of it? Are you going to protect it? Are you going to leak it out, right? I mean, it was just very basic. The next one was, so how are you going to use it? Who are you going to share it with? How is it going to be protected and utilized to my benefit, not necessarily just yours or somebody else that you're going to sell it to? And then finally, do I have any control over this? Can I get out of it? Can I tell you, no, thanks, I'm tired of you using my data for whatever is the purpose? And 70% of the respondents came back to us with, no, in general, we're very uncomfortable and don't really feel happy about sharing our private data. We saw some windows of opportunity where there was the willingness to share private data if there was some value exchange. If I could get something for giving you something of my private data, then maybe I'd be a little bit more interested. And that sort of varied between like about 23% in some countries down to about 15% in others. So we surveyed in Asia, in about 3 countries in Asia, and about 4 countries in Europe, and then we also surveyed obviously here in the U.S.
And were any of those findings a surprise to you?
Well, that was what so many people, the group that we did this with, are just like, look, you're not really surprised at this, right? You don't really want to give your data to anybody, do you? And I, well, no, that's true, but at the same time, we still are facing a channel here, and I use this, right? I'm pretending that my phone is in my hand. I don't know if you do this at all, but I mime this behavior that we have. Marketers right now know that eyeballs and attention and time are being spent on the device. And the device, the screen, whatever it is going to be how you get to the person that you want to get to in the most timely and relevant manner. So you get to that mobile moment, it's going to be something that's got to be timely. You're not going to be able to do that unless you have location, unless you have information about the consumer, that you have and understand their predisposition, what's their interest, what's their preference. And so we've got to figure out how to cross the divide, but do it in a way that it still throws its arm around privacy and keeps in mind, what do I want as a consumer? What does my customer look for in me in keeping my concerns at the forefront of my engagement, my relationship with them? And that's how marketers are really trying to think about and engage on the mobile device, and that's sort of very top of mind. How do I do so in a way that's always going to be wanted?
Okay, and Mara, you had mentioned in your earlier comment that one of the challenges you have, and I suspect some of the others as well, is that there are different rules about what you can do between the FTC to the FCC, the Europeans, and so on, and that, in fact, those rules are in the process of changing. Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is what's considered private in terms of location, whereas on the FCC side, it's precise location information, versus on the FCC side, it's location information, or what's classified as CPNI, and doesn't really make any distinction about whether it's accurate, timely, repeated, et cetera. So in that case, opt-in is required to expose any measure of location, whereas on the FTC side, for instance, your IP address, just by using the internet, is revealed, your location is revealed. White pages publish phone numbers, which give your exact home location, but when it's shared from a mobile device, and even if it's at a cell tower location, which may not even be as accurate as those others on the FTC side, commercial side, do require an explicit opt-in and have to be dealt with as private information, as if it were precise.
And we'll come back to the changes in a moment, but I want to bring Kirsten back in. So what's your observation about how, Mary has this wonderful survey and tells us in great detail what's going on, and then what do consumers actually do, and how do you explain kind of the mismatch or the cognitive dissonance?
So what I see, or what we've seen with consumers, actually really mirrors what Mary just described. We call them pragmatists on privacy. So They don't like sharing their information. They don't want to share that data, but they do want to use the app. And the app says to download this, you have to do this. So they take a second to weigh it, and they choose to download the app. And soon forget that they're sharing their location data. And they may also make assumptions about what that location data is being used for. So you download a weather app. Of course, it's so I know what the weather is where I'm at, right? Except that's also being shared to third parties, like my company, to inform ad targeting. Now, for my company, the challenge this poses is nobody's heard of us. You know, if you say, do you care if 4Info has your data? They're like, who? It's meaningless to most consumers. But if you ask them, do you care if Google has your data? Do you care if AT&T has your data? Well, I don't want those guys tracking me. It's a little bit of a paradox in the industry. It's challenging. And what we've seen in terms of opt-out rates, so we use the ad choices icon for transparency. We allow the brands to use their own ad choices icon as well. The opt-out rate for us is actually typically lower than it is for a brand. So a large brand, something you'd buy on a grocery store shelf, will see a higher opt-out rate, and I think it's this consumer perception that you don't want the big guys checking your data, but I don't know who this guy is, but I don't care.
Yeah, Larry, maybe I can add to that a little bit. We see that, you know, to something Mary said, is what's in it for the consumer and what do they get out of it is also very important. You know, we see that in some examples that we're currently running where we go from roadside assistance service providers, logistics companies, fraud prevention, companies like mobile lotteries and mobile wagering, and then marketing programs. At the roadside assistance end, someone's calling in and being told, we can use your location to help provide you faster service, identify where you are more precisely. We get like close to 99% opt-in rate. Nobody says no, and it's only for this one-time use. So it's, you know, is the information being used to deliver the immediate service? So high value to a logistics company might be trying to get a driver to consent to be located while carrying, a load, across country. They tend to not want to be tracked, but the logistics company found that if they give them an incentive, like maybe we'll pay you faster. Instead of 30 days, we'll pay you in 7 days. Or how about you opt in and you get a gift card for gas, discount on gas or something like that, the opt-in rates go much higher. Yeah. So I think the incentive and what's in it for them and the value proposition for the consumer is very important.
So that's a great example of a particular use case that kind of reveals more granular, desires and how to respond to them. Let me ask the other panelists. Mary, you first. Can you give us a similar use case where something you did or tried, it revealed some interesting insights?
Sure. Recently, Syniverse was very fortunate enough to put an investment into a company called Vibes. Vibes is one of the leading mobile marketing firms in the U.S., and they had a great example. Many of you will be familiar with Chipotle's misstep, if you can call it that, earlier this year, right? So they had a challenge, and they saw a huge drop-off in people attending and coming into the store, and had a 30% drop in their stock price. It was disastrous because of what was happening. And we worked with them to create a campaign where they used folks that had downloaded the app or were using a short code to where they pushed out 5.3 million offers that said, come in, get a free burrito. Very simple. Get a free burrito, right? You all are nodding your head. You probably got it, right? And they got a 3.7 million response. They went and redeemed it, a redemption rate. Unbelievable numbers, almost 70% in a redemption rate. And this was talked about on the earnings call that Chipotle did post that campaign to simply say, look at this, we were able to get these folks back. And of course, in the business, you're like, this is awesome. This is an incredible redemption rate. But it so clearly shows if you give somebody something that they want, there's some happiness being created here. And one of the things about, I was just fortunate enough to be listening to some insight on the upcoming FCC rulings. And this is this kind of creativity that we're talking about, where you take the information that you have about your customer, and maybe you already have an implicit relationship with them that gives you the opportunity to market to them. Send an email or send a text message or send a push notification that offers some sort of discount, some sort of value. Some of the rules that are being talked about right now that, will likely land post, in December or so from the FCC are really much more onerous than what has been understood by the FTC. So I think this differentiation that we're talking about here, this is a big deal because from our point of view, as I look at this and I think about, I'm already having to have conversation that says, wait a second, what you're looking to do, we can't quite do, goes a little bit farther afield from what's going to make everybody happy on privacy. This level of management of consumer information in order to ensure explicit opt-in, it's going to put a big burden, I think, on, I'm concerned about the burden it's going to put on the kind of innovation that we would see for mobile engagement and the way in which you would use the mobile device and mobile interaction to engage with your consumer, because it's just going to put the brakes on. It's going to make people very uncomfortable. I think that's my interpretation.
We're going to come back to that's actually the next topic.
Okay.
I know it's what everybody wants to talk
It's
about.
hard.
But,
it's hard.
I want to get some more ideas out of this. So let me come back to you, Kirsten. What example can you think of a sort of a recent use case that really generated some surprising or interesting insights about privacy or security or consumer behavior?
For us, we always have the same use case, which is advertising. We run campaigns for all kinds of companies, from big brands to kind of the more annoying advertising that tends to litter the internet where advertising is very cheap. One of the few metrics we can use is opt-out rates. I already mentioned that. What is fascinating is that we place the ad choices icon for transparency on all advertising, regardless of whether it's extremely targeted, such as a list of folks who have a Macy's card. That's a very targeted ad campaign. Or you can run on our entire network with no targeting whatsoever. Anyone with a phone could potentially get an ad. Either way, there's an ad choices icon. The highest opt-out rates are on those run-a-network ads, and it tends to be due to the content of the ad rather than the degree of targeting involved in delivering that ad. So people opt out when they get ads from dating services. They opt out when they get ads that kind of look spammy, like offers for gift cards. That's what causes people to opt out, not the underlying targeting. So for us, the challenge is helping consumers understand really how they can control what they see on their device, because opting out of targeting when it was never a targeted ad to begin with won't help them see fewer Match.com ads or whatever it is they're objecting to.
So it's very interesting because sort of one theory about targeting is, on the one hand, from a marketer standpoint, this is a pre-qualified consumer, and presumably, if it is something you want, then you're glad you got it. But at the same time, there's still that what I sometimes call the creepy factor, where I'm on eBay and I'm looking at an auction for vintage comic books, and I come over to Facebook, and the auction follows me over to Facebook, and I understand from a technical standpoint that Facebook has no idea, that came over and Facebook didn't know or doesn't have anything to do with that. But at a visceral level, I do react, and I think, hey, who asked you to follow me over here to Facebook? But you find that, in fact, when you give them the option to opt out, it's the opposite. They opt out of the non-specific ads.
Exactly. It's more content-driven than targeting-driven, and it's because consumers don't know how the ad ends up on their device, ultimately. And we'd like to make that more clear, but it's not very easy. There's technologists who have a hard time understanding how that happens.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk now about some of these policy issues, and particularly since some of them are really in the middle here, and some of them quite dramatic. So you all mentioned and I mentioned the FCC's privacy proceeding, and under at least the proposal that was circulated, and we'll see what the final looks like. The idea is that ISPs, who are now no longer subject to the FTC's jurisdiction thanks to the common carrier designation, would face a very different regime. So they would, in fact, for many kinds of very traditional internet advertising, would be required to get opt-in, and as opposed to the sort of standard or the practice we've had up till now everywhere else, which is opt-out. We've never had that anywhere really in the internet ecosystem in the US. Mario, talk a little about what impact that would have. Obviously, you're not an ISP, but in fact, none of you are ISPs. But obviously, some of your customers or some of your customers' customers are. So, what would be the impact of having different rules for ISPs versus edge providers?
Yeah, I can give you one example where we use both sets of information in fraud mitigation for regulated gaming and lottery ticket purchase requires two factors of location verification. So typically one comes from the app or IP geolocation, which is under FTC rules. It's being gotten through edge solutions, either an app or through a database. And a business can do with that and expose terms of use related to the storage of that data, how to handle it, what to do with it in the event of a breach. Another factor of authentication on a mobile device is to query the carrier network and say, where is this device now? Which can be cell tower kind of vicinity of location, not precise location, less precise than the GPS that might come from the app, but the user must explicitly opt in for that location to be included as part of that fraud mitigation solution. And then how that data gets handled once the carrier has revealed it, they essentially flow down the FCC requirements onto ourselves and whoever that's shared with. And even in the proposed rules, not only the opt-in, but for instance, in the event of a breach, if that data were to be revealed, then the operator, I think the rules say that the operator should be the one to notify the user if there is a breach. So that has to flow through the chain, but then the end solution provider also has to notify that end user, and it creates kind of a confusing environment with the end user, the storage of that information and the analytics of the data, so that precise information that they're obtaining through these edge technologies can be analyzed and stored and done. They can do things with it that are much more flexible than the less precise information that may have come from the carrier. And if the user asks to delete the carrier data, well, they're deleting the less precise information, but yet the more precise is still in the system, and there's really hasn't been any real change in the amount of data being revealed or stored. And then in terms of what the consumer sees is that these providers who provide these services have to present both sets of terms to a user that says, well, this data is subject to these terms, and when we use this data, it's subject to these terms. And it just becomes a very confusing situation, that hard to scale.
Mary, how would the proposed rule affect your business and your customers?
So the term permission-based marketing has been one that essentially refers to the opting-in process. And from our point of view, marketers are still thinking, okay, if I've got, my website is mobile-enabled, I have an app, these are pretty much the ways I'm going to reach my consumer. If I've gotten opting in on notifications and location, if I'm lucky, from the app, then perhaps I can still push from that. Managing that sort of constant database of information and having that, what is the objective of marketing at this stage of the game is to have this sort of single view of the customer, right? To be able to say, I have a single view of Mary. I know what she likes. I know what she buys. I know, what if I'm a Bank of America customer, she almost never goes into the branch. She owns she has these particular products. What else could I possibly sell to her? Is she mostly on her app? Is she mostly on the web? What is it, right? So it's this single view of how does she interact with me as a brand. And so the ability to enhance and change and become tighter, right? It's not the instance of just one interaction. A brand that's looking to create a relationship is trying to constantly figure out, how do I grow that interaction? How do I constantly put my value in front of her? And that's where I see the biggest challenge, is where if there is information that is present about that consumer that they can either buy or they have themselves as a brand, does this put more onerous obligation on them to sort of go back out and get voluntary opting in? Do they need to go through a whole nother process simply because they've got internal counsel and external counsel saying to them, okay, well, just in case, let's just go out and make sure for sure that they're okay with you interacting with them via the mobile in this manner. And there's already enough stagnation and discomfort to some degree within marketing departments, and we're constantly seeing more being spent in mobile as a channel, but it becomes a great deal of an issue if there's even more discomfort, because they're constantly managing this sort of creepy factor. How creepy do I want to be? How much am I reaching out to you on the device? Is this too much? That is a real thing. That is absolutely something I talk to CMOs about all the time, and it's so you definitely they definitely get it. But what's a challenge is just like, well, by adding these additional rules, whatever they ultimately look like, when they land, they're still not going to be, in many respects, as clear-cut and understood as what the FTC framework has been. And I think that's it's just going to throw a wrench into a lot of these conversations. It's certainly, it's certainly going to slow down discussions for me in some of the conversations we're having.
So let's make it even more complicated. So we have, we have the traditional opt-out and the FTC, we might as well call it the FTC regime. We have the potential opt-in of the FCC. Now let's put on top of that the European Union and the Privacy Shield, which is its own set of rules and very new now, and sort of new framework, and one that, as I said, may not survive very long, depending on how it's challenged. Is the Privacy Shield something that affects any of your companies, and particularly any of your customers?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely dealing with that. So we sell these services globally around the world, and we'll have conversations where we just simply will leave whole countries off of our discussions. I mean, Germany is, in and of itself, has always had such incredibly high privacy regulations in comparison to sort of other places in the EU. But what this does is kind of make it a little bit more, it hasn't leveled the playing field entirely across the 27 countries. It's really made it a little bit more understood where there was sort of weakness or lack of definition, but now it has put some framework in place, but where there was very strict privacy rules to begin with, it just sort of adds insult to injury, really. It's sort of what we're seeing. So, but it's, the same challenges exist, though. It's the same questions. How can I get to my consumer on the device that I know that is the closest to them at all times? And
Mario, Kirsten, do either of you have?
Yeah, I can. You want to go ahead?
Well, just quick answer. It's been a barrier to entry for us. So
The Privacy Shield.
Yeah, well,
or the
not
EU
Privacy
generally?
Shield. I mean, even before Privacy Shield, the EU in general was challenging for us, just straight up our business model. We were making inroads, but the whole Privacy Shield thing, it's like starting over. And for us, as a small company, it's a complete barrier to international expansion.
Mario?
Yeah, I would echo that, but we also see kind of an indirect influence by the difference in regulation in that, our focus is providing services to enterprise. So when we talk to companies that operate in Europe or are based in Europe, seeking to engage with a company that's based in the US, now they say, well, if you work with us, even if you house the data in Europe on servers there, you're a US entity, now you're subject to US law around what data you have access to, even though it's European consumers and companies that are taking advantage of that data, and they're reluctant to say, well, we'd rather get that from a European company, because it will be subject only to one set of rules, and then, even if it's a subsidiary, there's reach, potentially for, government reaching through and, getting to that data anyway. So it's really put a chill on how we pursue, especially the European market.
yeah, I mean, some of these rules I go back to when we first launched in serving mobile network operators in India. If you want to serve an operator in India, you have to keep all of the data for that Indian subscriber in India. It can't traverse back to any other country. So we've had to build data centers in India to ensure that it stays present. And there are a couple of other examples of that.
It's just because I remember correctly your survey response that the consumers in India were the ones who were most likely to trust that the data that was being taken about them was being protected or used properly.
But I will go further than that, which is so great that you remember that. There's some of the first examples of sponsored usage in India that go back probably almost 4 or 5 years. The average revenue per user in India is one of the lowest in the world, but yet they have found some of the most interesting and nimble ways to utilize the device because it is in fact actually one of the only ways you can get to a consumer in India. It is one of the only channels available to them. There's not TVs, there's not house phones, it's really a challenge. And so mobile has been a little bit more aggressive in the way in which it's the value exchange has been made more of a present and understood activity by the Indian consumer than it has in other places.
So I'm going to turn over to the audience in a minute. Let me just ask one more question of the panel, and then I'll turn it over. So obviously, regulation by regulators is one solution, but another solution, and obviously for many of us, the preferable solution is industry self-regulation. Now we have a lot of it in sort of formal bodies and also informal bodies. We have standards, and we have, you mentioned ad choices and things of this nature. Let me ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Kirsten, what could industry do to be more formal or more direct in terms of self-regulation that might take some of the pressure off and sort of keep some of the more slow-moving real regulators at bay?
I think one of the things we can do is rely less on contractual compliance on privacy issues and really have everyone in the industry put direct effort into ensuring actual compliance with privacy regulations. The diversity of mobile apps is so huge that nobody can check every app for compliance. But if every small company checks every app for their top performing apps for compliance, you're going to hit almost all of the ads that are out there that consumers care about. I think also the industry needs to look carefully at what's happening with private schemas. So Facebook and Google own so much of the mobile advertising ecosystem. Apple controls the IDFA, the identifier on the phone. And the industry relies heavily on that. And Apple can change rules when they feel like it. I feel like they created the IDFA for the industry, but now we're beholden to it. And whether some other regulatory body wants to take that on, it might benefit the industry in the long run. The problem is who do we trust to own that data? It's actually similar to what Mary was talking about as far as that singular idea of the customer. You know, if it's an Apple device right now, it's Apple's IDFA, which is a little bit frightening.
So just curious, before I go to the other panelists, so if I did do that, if I took my top performing apps and I checked them for compliance, what would I find they're not complying with?
Not disclosing the use of location for advertising purposes.
Would that be number one?
Opt-in happens. So the explicit opt-in to sharing location data, that's pretty much always there, partly because Google Store and Apple mandate it. But disclosing that it's used for advertising, very hard to find quite often, and sometimes not there at all.
I see. Okay. So Mario, what do you think? What more can we do to keep the wolves at bay?
Yeah, I think for us, we see we're not so much tied into the advertising use of location, but it's more for solving an operational challenge that a business might have or engaging with their consumers in a more effective way. So they tend to be less, really focused on compliance with regulation and industry best practices to mitigate risk and exposure that they might have in delivering those services. So they have more control over how the content, how the services are being delivered. So the self-regulatory environment works well, except we get into situations where, as an aggregator, we're sourcing data from different sources. So like we have CTIA best practices for location-based services that has really been our guide with regard to use of cellular information, but then each operator has their own interpretation or perspective on those rules and may impose a different set of requirements, for instance, on how long data may be retained or the opt-in language. And sometimes we get into conflicting verbiage where we get one operator that says, well, you may say you're opting in on behalf of a third party, and the other says, no, it must be the third party saying that the user is opting in specifically for them. Okay, well, I can't do both. So the self-regulation is good, but requires a lot of debate, conversation. So having some regulatory push that at least drives a debate and gets to an outcome that is consensus-driven is good. But I think, starting from, seeking input from industry, I think is
And just to be clear, do you think that's what has been happening? Are they driving that conversation, or are they driving
Well,
a
I think
completely
they're
different
driving the conversation, but maybe starting from a standpoint that had some preconceived approaches that maybe didn't have that input taken into account. And so, but I think you can argue about the process, but I think the outcome, will ultimately be good if the inputs are taken into account.
So you're an optimist.
I'm an optimist.
Mary, are you an optimist?
I like to think I am. I'm not sure if what I'm about to say reflects that. I agree very much with what Kirsten said. I think one of the things that we've found in regulation in the past is that sometimes it heats the argument up so much that it can change behavior inside of industries and corporations. And I think just purely based on the fact that, Kirsten, you're sitting here with this title of Chief Privacy Officer, something that didn't exist. It's something new that's so recent. And I think it's something that is, as members of the industry, and when I say that, I'm throwing my arms around almost anything that's looking to interact with the consumer on mobile. What's happened in Europe and what's happening in the US right now, what's happened in different places, China's got a whole other set of things we could talk about for days. What I think about this is that if it can push and drive the industry to take a good hard look at how are we managing this? How are we building privacy and privacy awareness from the get-go into the way in which we deliver services, into the way in which we communicate our value to the consumer, right? I mean, I think I am a little frustrated that in the US right now, we're a little bit reacting to what's happened in the EU. That's a little bit of how I'm seeing it. So it's just like, okay, well, you're going to go here, we're going to go here, you know, and it's a little bit of that. I'm hoping that we can see a little bit of walking back on some of the rules that are currently being, that are part of the discussion. I think that, you know, the October meeting, you know, will be interesting for the FCC to hopefully we'll get a little bit of movement. I'm just frustrated that it's had to come so quickly before really we as an industry could get to the point of saying this is something we have to be doing. We need to have that person in charge of privacy and looking at it. If we're going to be doing a service, whether I'm selling B2B or I'm selling a B2C related service, I need to be constantly thinking about, is it touching a consumer? If it is, all right, well then we need to figure out how we're managing privacy. So it's just got to be a part of the way in which we go to market. And I just don't think we've thought that way. And so I just don't think it's been a part of our dialogue. And frankly, you know, every legal department's going to look at you and say, well, don't say anything yet until somebody tells you that you have to. Right? So we don't want to borrow trouble. We don't want to borrow trouble in advance of this. So we didn't do anything. And so now we're kind of, you know, in the seat that we're in, which is we're going to have it regulated on top of us. So I'm anxious to see what the next, you know, few months brings in the ultimate final ruling, as it were.
We're all anxious, and anxious is probably the right word. So as you can see, my panel here, they're people who think deeply about these issues and on a daily basis. Let me see if there's any questions. Jennifer has the mic, so if you wait for the mic, and I try to see, I can't quite see everyone. Any questions? Panel? All right, well, while you're being shy, let me ask another question. So you mentioned China a second ago, and that made me think, and I was just in China, and yeah, I haven't recovered actually yet. So to what extent, we'll come back to where we started with privacy by design, to what extent do each of you see privacy design as both a competitive advantage, not just something you have to do to, you know, keep regulators away or to keep customers happy or keep consumers happy? To what extent do you see privacy design already as a competitive advantage for your company vis-a-vis your competitors? And to what extent you might see that as a competitive advantage for the United States versus other markets? Kirsten, why don't we start with you?
It absolutely is. Privacy became top of mind around 2009 when the Wall Street Journal did their series on internet privacy. Consumers became aware of it. More importantly, brands became aware of it. Nobody wants to be the company on the cover of the Wall Street Journal who is violating consumers' privacy. So any smart brand who's looking at doing really sophisticated mobile advertising thinks about privacy. They want to know, how are you doing this? How are you taking care of it? Am I going to end up on the cover of the Wall Street Journal if I work with you? And for us, being ahead of that game has been so helpful. Having guidelines before there were guidelines, being able to educate the brand on what is done in mobile to protect privacy, having all those materials prepared. In terms of versus our competitors, it's been an absolute win.
How so? Say a little more.
I don't want to badmouth my competitors, but what we hear back from brands is we haven't been able to understand how they de-identify location data. It seems like they're keeping and reusing location data longer than they should. Brands are concerned about this both in terms of privacy, but also how good is where you were last year as an indicator of who you are today? How about 2 weeks ago, yesterday? Those are things that you have to think about constantly to develop something that's useful for the client.
Got it. And so, Mario, what about for LocationSmart? Is it a competitive advantage?
Yeah, I think so. I just got back from China since you mentioned them, and I met with operators, infrastructure providers, businesses that want to use this information, and everyone's saying, well, people don't want to share this information. Mm-hmm. And the approach we've taken is having kind of a purpose-driven reason to have the location. And designing that into, as I said, the system that gets an opt-in when it's required, only using location when it's necessary, and only for the duration that it's necessary. And then walking people through that kind of understanding of, here's how it can be done in a way that first of all, what's the purpose? And letting the consumer know the purpose and that it's a value to them. And I think that helps break that down, and then putting the controls in place that manages that in both process and technology, I think at least gives an opening to have a greater willingness to go down a path and let's test out some services. You know, and at the front end of those conversations, it was, you know, it's just, you know, people don't want to share information. So.
And Mary, you can either talk about it from the standpoint of your business, but also from the standpoint of competitive advantage of sort of the U.S. market to other markets. I mean, one question I'll ask all of you, but I'll let Mary go first, is to what extent is sort of U.S. leadership in the mobile ecosystem a function of how well we do on privacy, at least relative to other markets? But Mary, you can answer whatever question you like.
I'll pick one. I'll go with the U.S. perspective, and is there a competitive advantage? I find this topic to be very local. It's very, when I'm in China, it's a very local discussion because it's about the Chinese consumer. So it ends up coming back, and so from a buyer, when I'm selling to someone, I'm not necessarily, there's, depending upon who it is, if they're a big global multinational, then I'll get, hopefully, somewhat of a more multinational feedback. And so then they have to think about, okay, who am I going to go and sell to? If I have a Latin American group, how are they going to react to this? What's the kind of regulatory environment that they're facing? What's my, my EMEA look like? So it becomes very entrenched in the perspective of that consumer and what's acceptable to that consumer and what has been the precedence that's been set. So I don't find any particular benefit from the U.S. perspective in sort of in comparison to anybody else. It definitely is a very local feel to it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. We found that use cases in the U.S. just don't translate into every market. We went into like India or China and talk about roadside assistance services, completely different perspective on how consumers deal with a breakdown and what the response to that would be. So, and it spans across all the use cases. So really need to understand the consumer and how that market would consume the services.
Yeah.
Hey, Kirsten, are you outside the U.S. or just India? So,
U.S. only.
So, yay team.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Right. If there's time for a quick question, if anybody thought of one. If not, going once, going twice.
Oh.
Yes. Hang on, just wait.
I'm bringing the
mic
mic
will
to
be
you.
right there. And really quick.
So, no pressure. So I think it's very interesting. All of this has been very interesting, but I think it's interesting that you talk about how the consumer, as far as wanting to opt out, I think when we see those come through on our phones and the opportunity to opt out occurs to us, it's easy to say, oh, instinctually you're thinking they're taking my information and I don't know what they're going to do with it. By the same token, when they don't offer that opt-out service and something appears on your screen that is beneficial and useful to you, that everybody likes that, right, to some capacity. And I would even take it a stretch further to say, would we even need DVRs if we didn't need to fast forward through the commercials because they applied to us? So I guess my question is, do you see that going that direction when it comes to television and taking it a step further? Because I know we're all glued to our devices, but we're still, TV's not going anywhere either. And I kind of feel like if everything were more targeted towards our needs, we would embrace it.
Oh, yeah.
And I get one-word answers, please.
Yes.
Agreed.
Same here.
Great. We can talk more offline, but we ran out of time, so I don't want to keep the next group waiting. But we'll leave that for the next discussion. Again, please join me in thanking my esteemed panel here.